when we want to think about how that sort of becomes a part of it, excuse me, when we think about how that becomes a part of cultural life in Lowell, it helps to understand pop culture, where that comes from. One thing to keep in mind is that the idea of Jim Crow, and Scott mentioned it, of Jim Crow segregation refers to a minstrel character put together in the 1830s in the North for performers, and it was a caricature of African Americans. The song went, "I turn around and jump around and do just so, and every time I turn around to jump Jim Crow." And it was a white performer who darkened his face, exaggerated features, and performed in sort of what he would define as African American style, which was patently his invention. And that became a very popular stage performance for that particular actor. It caught on. And it will be very much based in racially sort of structured music and entertainment. And what it will also do is it will also pull in African Americans by the 1850s and 60s. If you wish to have access to the performing stage, African American performers would have to conform to this expectation. White audiences loved it. It was very popular. It combined, and a minstrel would be sort of song and dance and a particular type of music, sort of a very stylized version. That will also be spread through showboats, which were sort of traveling venues on the Ohio and tributary rivers, some of them with integrated casts, which all performed this sort of very racially stereotyped music in the 19th century. And it was wildly popular. In fact, there was also the rise of sheet music. And so sheet music would spread everywhere. And this is also very, very racially, today, essentially, if you say certain words and so forth that are viewed as unacceptable, these are going to be trafficked just openly, and there's no point. In fact, my students have been shocked and said, "Are you trying to shock us?" And my response is, "No. This is, if you want to know how far it goes, it was completely socially acceptable among white communities. And in fact, some of the most popular songs were written by African Americans, because if you wanted to have access to it, you did that. Even Scott Joplin got pulled into that sort of system. So the power of that popularity could not be denied, and it is national. Tin Pan Alley, one of the things is that not only did they create, Irving Berlin, they also created a range of songs that would be shocking to our ear today. And that is popular from the 1830s well into the 19 teens. It will decline a little bit after the First World War, but then it will also pick up speed again with the publication in the 1920s of Edna Ferber's Showboat, about a white family performers who do so in blackface and wish to leave it behind and become more acceptable performers. You would think that's sort of enlightened. If you read the novel, one, it's not great, and two, it's not very enlightened. And in 1929, there was the film Showboat, which was one of the first sort of sound films that did splice sound and sort of spoken word together. It was actually made before the advent of that. 1927 also saw that resurgence in interest with the Al Jolson film, The Jazz Singer, a Jewish musician who plays a sort of stereotyped African-American music. The class is in blackface, and it was the first sound film. And so it is a fascinating sort of portrait of both of ethnic and racial stereotypes all at once in one film. And so that regains power. And then there's going to be another film of Showboat in 1936, which will be the one that most people remember, and also a musical as well. So in the early 1930s. So these are part of pop culture. And it's not just Lowell per se, it's everywhere. In fact, in the Lowell Area Historical Museum, there is a booklet that was published in the 19 teens about how to create your minstrel show, with all the things. And I've had a chance to look at it. It's terrifying to its extent of how you would apply the makeup, the style, the dialect, the dance routines. And it's published nationally, and you could actually buy a kit. They sold kits for it. So again, it's a very powerful piece. Another thing to keep in mind too, and the Jim Crow Museum at Ferris State also has a huge amount of this material, is the level of racial stereotyping that is a part of all sorts of product. But you can have it not only for Aunt Jemima's syrup and Uncle Ben's, which I'm startled they've managed to survive until recently, but on almost everything. The sheer number of everything from domestic salt and pepper shakers all the way up to artwork is jarring to really think about it. And so it's very much ingrained in cultural expectations, not only in the South, but in the North. And that really brings that sort of expectation to where that sort of expectation of mockery is not just for one place, it's just the deal. And I think that's the hardest part to get our minds around, is that is so ingrained. You would need to tell chunks of American society that it was unacceptable, and especially when you have so little experience. Michigan is an odd state because unlike Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, which border on Kentucky and had a great deal of back and forth between communities, and what in fact Southern Ohio is referred to as the butternut belt. What you have is you have communities that are very diverse. If you, I taught briefly at Ohio University, and if you drive through that part of Southern Ohio, it's far more diverse than you would expect for what is ostensibly a northern state. But Michigan only really got a large African American population with the rise of industrialization, and that drew families primarily to major industrial cities such as Kalamazoo, Pontiac, Detroit, obviously, Saginaw, Flint. And it really has left the state's population largely skewed, even though in the southern two tiers of county, there are far more integrated communities than we might expect. But the further north you go, the less diversity appears very quickly. And that has remained a very durable phenomena well into the 21st century. So the combination of music, commercial operation, and for Lowell, the only African Americans when I was doing the census, and that was a major question, was were there African Americans in the area? And I thought, well, that's a great question. So I went through the census, including all the way to the 19th century, where there were off-year censuses, and simply they would one or two families would appear and then not be there the next. And what threw me off was it borders Ionia County, and Ionia County had a rather substantial African American population. And when I first was looking at it for a little bit, I thought, well, how is that working? And then I thought, oh wait, there's Ionia. It was the prison population that was counted in their census. So in many cases, Grand Rapids had a very small African American population, as historians Randall Jelks and Todd Robinson have noted, which meant that it was so small as were many parts of the city's own residents would have very little contact with African Americans, that they're simply not a visible part of that and could be easily not paid attention to, despite the long term. And African Americans have been in Grand Rapids area for a very long time, before, frankly, before Michigan became even a state. But that is sort of the piece. Lowell is not alone. In fact, Lowell, in the article, one of the things that I wanted to argue, and I'm glad Scott agreed with me, was that Lowell really isn't all that special. It's actually quite common for Michigan. I mean, frankly, if you've been to Lowell, you've been to Sandusky, you've been to Clare, you've been to Fremont, you've been to a range of places that are all, ironically, they're all on rivers. They all have little boat things. They all have little festivals, and they're perfectly interesting little towns. But what made Lowell particularly interesting is the Showboat, and that they were able to put that together. So Lowell's lack of interaction with African Americans meant that even if African Americans passed through or did some business, they were not permanent residents. And so there is very little interaction to challenge assumptions, to alter those perceptions. Doesn't mean that Lowell participated in overtly racist acts because it was fun prior to the Showboat, probably, but it didn't really show up. It didn't have anything to say that it was especially unusual, which I always sort of tell folks, it explains, it doesn't justify. It's an explanation, it's very typical, and it's typical of hundreds of towns throughout Michigan and the northern part, which our closest compatriot for how our population is sort of spread out is actually Wisconsin. We share a lot in common with Wisconsin. The northwest part of the state is very sparsely populated. Everybody's jammed along the Lake Michigan coast, running north from Chicago into Madison. And very much like Michigan, it's a band along I-96. And then once you get to the M46 line and go north, it becomes very, very, very small towns, which is my background. My experience was I was actually pleasantly surprised that the Lowell Historical Museum was willing to actually talk about it. Many communities, and I would like to point this out, over the years, I've worked with different groups to preserve some forms of Ku Klux Klan memorabilia, which sounds strange to say, but oftentimes when families discover these sorts of things, they immediately either throw them in a burn pile and destroy it because no one wants to know that grandpa was a member of the Klan. But what it means is that it wasn't because I wished it to venerate it. It is to ensure that there's a physical reminder that it should go to a museum, that this did exist, that it can't just be thrown down a memory hole and denied that that's a part of it. Some communities have found that there are large collections of Klan membership cards, which are really troubling to those groups. And in fact, they've been given to archival centers to both provide access and also because many local institutions face such pressure to dispose of them because no one wants to do that because of what that piece is, not because of enlightenment, primarily because of the fear of what that says about a community. For Lowell itself, there has been over the years, both before we've done this, and I've had a little bit of that in my time. I was asked to talk a little bit about it with a group. Is that the Showboat was so popular and it was so ingrained into the city. It brought money for city development. It brought a host of resources to that. And it was not just a small town show. And that's an important thing. It reached a regional audience. I found advertisements as far away as Minneapolis, as far south as Louisville, all the way out into Albany, New York, that this was a big draw. Even in the Chicago Tribune featured advertisements every year. The West Michigan Tourism Bureau featured it. This was a really big component, and that it also was a combination of national performers and also the end men who were both a mixture of professionals and local community members, as Scott mentioned earlier. So there's a lot of buy-in to this. This isn't like the carnival that comes in, you have the carnival, they pack up and they go home. Surprise, the carnival is you. And that really ingrained it. And that people, in many ways, I sometimes suspect that in my own family, the answer sometimes came up was to say, it was okay to think it, it wasn't okay to say it. That's what other people did. And so there's a weird disjuncture for many people's minds between what you could say or what you could do. And you can see that sometimes the defensiveness comes, I suspect in part, because they realize that this probably isn't going to fly anymore. But at a certain point, as we found in the article, and reading, and incidentally, much of the information came from the newspaper, there was already at least some conversation about how does this go on as early as the early 1960s, that people began to feel like, should we go on with this? Is this acceptable? And what we found was, the answer was yes, we're going to go forward. It was a conscious choice. It didn't just happen, or oops, we didn't know. They had eaten of the tree of knowledge and proceeded forward. In my experience, many people wish to tell me, well, my family didn't know. It was back in the day. We didn't understand. We didn't know. And that clashes with what the conversations that took place in the newspaper, in public. I would emphasize, if you read the Lowell Ledger, which is digitized, you can read letters to the editor, conversations. These are not secret discussions. The discussions that were perhaps less public were done by the committee that ran it. But even today, there's a lot of disjuncture. I think partly it reflects the political split and our sense of political correctness, that no one's going to take it away. And what was a long time ago, and we don't do that anymore. And we're really sorry. We don't say it, but probably we think it, perhaps. And so my experience has been that there has been some jarring senses and efforts to justify it. And as I've tried to explain to people, and I've had a few people who've been confused and felt like, are you justifying? And my answer is no. We're trying to explain that this is a part of that sort of identity, and it does fit into its time. But frankly, because of those public discussions, that is how I have responded to resistance, is to say, this isn't a secret. This isn't public. Your forebears did talk about this, and there was a conscious choice. It was not just, oops, we didn't know. Much like the Lost Cause, people didn't come to love that sort of image of Robert E. Lee just out of the goodness of their heart in America. I would argue to you, and I would add to Scott's earlier point, the Lost Cause is perhaps the greatest advertising / propaganda campaign in American history, and it's stunningly successful. I will tell you, my own experience was, when I was a young person, I kind of felt like, so the South won the Civil War. And I had a teacher get very angry with me. And I said, I don't know. Everybody's got a Confederate flag. We talk about Robert E. Lee all the time, all the way up here in the land of the Enchanted Mitten. I thought they lost the war. And so I've had many students that have also said, well, I kind of feel like the South won the war. They got their way, didn't they? And I always kind of smiled and said, but that's a tradition as well. And that's an uncomfortable concept. And I think that's the resistance, is it's jarring to be confronted with that. But I've had very few people write me or speak to me, especially aggressive. I think maybe it's because I'm from Michigan that kind of helps. And I always kind of tell folks, if you're uncomfortable, guess what? Where I grew up, we had no conversations about diversity or race at all. And I think that also is sort of the thing that does that. Scott, what do you think?
As far as Lowell residents, I have had no resistance whatsoever. In fact, they've been, and as Matthew said, the Lowell Historical Society or Historical Museum, which I think encompasses it all, has been very supportive. Lowell residents I haven't heard anything negative. Now, granted, I've talked to probably a dozen at most, so it's not anything extraordinary. And the article I haven't read. Have you read the comments, Matthew? Or are there any feedback in the editorial letters after the article was published?
No, there were no editorial pushback to it at all. In fact, it was a sort of a discussion more about what else went on. I did get asked about the Chesaning Showboat, which did do a similar venue, but they got rid of their sort of Southern theme pretty early on. It was like one thing to keep in mind too, for more context, is that in the late 1940s was the Disney film put forward a mixture of live action and cartoon, which was Song of the South, for which on many children's CDs today, Zippity Doo Dah, the song exists, but the film is not accessible. And so I sort of find that's the only film that's been banned because it also trafficked in that. And sort of the use of minstrel, I think also what makes Lowell's sort of struggle with it is that it went on for so long, well into the 1970s, when that sort of public, large, regionally advertised show with national performers both had kind of started to die out, as much as Lowell eventually did, but also that, like, Hollywood had sort of turned away. When I was looking through IMDb, the Internet Movie Database, I found that a lot of that sort of stuff really petered out by around 1954, 1955. It just sort of like vanished. And I'm not sure if it was because of any sort of racial sensitivity, but certainly it sort of, my suspicion was it like the Hollywood musical. It was just simply past its sell-by date at that point and was no longer popular, the dollars rather than sensibilities. But it really does touch on that sense that for today's resistance, in some ways, I would be more suspicious if it doesn't speak more to political divisions currently existing, rather than a real love of the Showboats entity. The Showboat, as people would remember it, is now, 43 years in the past. I mean, that's many, many years ago, and very few, an increasingly small number of people are going to remember that. And in fact, I had one person I spoke to at an Ollie event said, I went to see it, around the time it was going away, and we didn't go after about 1970 because it wasn't very good. That it had really lost a lot of that sort of steam. Because again, it also reminds us, and we wrote in the article, was that it had sort of run out of gas at that point. It was competing with national, remember, until the Beatles in the mid 1960s, there were no sort of like large national events that you would go to an arena and go see something play. It's a new entertainment, and television and so forth had really taken a bite out of that event, and it got smaller every year. And also that the Showboats organizers, if you look at the shows, and another thing, when I've had even the smallest amount of resistance, I pushed back and said, well, who did they get? And people go, well, they got Pearl Bailey. I'm like, yeah, they got Pearl Bailey. And I always survey folks. I'm like, how many folks remember Pearl Bailey? They don't remember Pearl Bailey. I remember Pearl Bailey. And many of the acts became smaller and smaller. You didn't get the really big names, and that spoke to the change in pop culture. So in many ways, it, even within the Showboat, it became pretty clear reading the materials that their effort to go on with it was a very conscious choice rather than tradition or something along those lines. You can sort of code it in that, and I'm sure there was a degree of it, but it really began to be very clear that the voices against it popped up much louder than had in the past. And so I think Lowell, I think communities don't like to be reminded of it, but it really keeps it from being, I think, romanticized and sort of downplayed. And I think that when there was a debate over the rebuilding of the Showboat recently, that was the bigger piece, was to say maybe it's time for a new name. And that was something that we wanted to emphasize, that it wasn't always what it was. It actually did change. There's been like 5 or 6 boats, and the first ones weren't even named Robert E. Lee. That was another choice. And so there are options available to deal with it and to not hide it, and to deal with it, and to come to terms with that phenomena, but not to forget it and not to just dismiss it.